So today's webinar will focus on issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing. And we hope that you will be able to develop a better understanding about the potential conflict between outcome expectations, the research problem, and the research question. This is a troublesome triple. And specifically, we will look into why working with research problems is a challenge, to learn how to identify and articulate workplace-based issues, how to frame problems, to practice how to problematize and articulate research problems, how to derive corresponding research questions, and to ensure that these are actionable. And finally, in the closing part, we will look a bit into guides and guidance and why these are often tricky. And then go off the record and close with a group activity where we will engage in a collaborative problem framing. Now, why is this particular topic of relevance? Because it will be about skills that are to be developed through the entire doctoral journey. So it's a very gradual process to develop on how to identify issue, on how to problematize, and how to derive related research questions. And as initially said, it's often located within the triple trouble, which is getting outcome expectations, research problem, and research questions well aligned. With this, let us look into the start why working with research problems is a challenge. Now, the one constant for all dissertations and for all research for that matter is the need to state the problem of the study based on scholarly literature. But what often is omitted from most research sequences is an understanding of what constitutes actually a research problem in the first place and how to articulate it in a logical manner. So this is one of the big issues, that students often lack the understanding of what constitutes a problem in the first instance. And in addition to that, you are asked to articulate the problem in the light of the literature, in light of the scholarly literature. Now, how can you tell what is the relevant scholarly literature if you still haven't grasped what is the problem? So this is a bit of a chicken and egg issue in here. Now, can you tell what constitutes a problem in the first place? Is that trained? And if it's not trained, how are we getting trained on that? And in addition to this, how to articulate the problem within a problem statement, so not in isolation, but in a logical manner. And we will look into examples of this. Now, how to identify and articulate workplace-based issues. Problem framing is an iterative process. It's not something that starts out at the beginning with just putting forward a problem statement and then that is standing there until the end of your research. No, but rather it is something that gradually emerges and that needs to be crafted out and worked out. So the first versions of a problem statement are often very rudimentary. They are lightweighted, and only over time they become more grounded and robust. Now, how to identify and articulate workplace-based issues. Now, what is an issue? Perhaps it's something that's problematic, not as it's supposed to be, something that's broken, a pain point, something that's pressing, something that's dark, something that's inconvenient, something that you don't really understand. And unlike a problem that we can clearly articulate, it might be that you're not even knowing what are the underlying root causes. Why is this happening always? Why can't I describe this being always there? Why, for example, is the roof still broke, so I try to fix it so often? Why each morning, once I go to work, there is such an inconvenient climate with my teammates? Why don't I get that out here? So it's something that you don't understand. But as you can see, it is something that can be sensed and observed. So it's something really concrete and real and not something abstract or fictional. So you really can see it and observe it. And we will look into a concrete example soon on how that is. So what is an issue? Let us look into this example. AI experts says automation could replace 40% of jobs in 15 years. Speaking to CBC News, Scott Pelley, in an interview for 60 Minutes on Sunday, Guy Fulit said that he believes 40% of the world's job will be replaced by robots capable of automating tasks. He said that both blue-collar and white-collar professions will be affected, but he believes those who drive for a living could be most affected. Now, is this an issue? Let us look into that. While this development might be problematic for those that lose their job, it's not a problem as such. Ultimately, it's not an issue, but progress. So it's something meant to happen, something that's obvious to happen, and it is not limited to this particular case. It's just progress. It has happened in the past, it will happen in the future, and as better we understand it, as better we understand which progress it will be. Will it be problematic if I am a worker who is affected and gets unemployed? Yes, to me, certainly that will be a problematic situation, but that's again meant to be like that. It's to be progress. So therefore I could reskill and get a job and employment in a different area where I'm of more use. Let's look into the second example. Last year, a strange self-driving car was released onto the quiet roads of Monmouth County, New Jersey. It was unlike anything demonstrated by Google, Tesla, or General Motors. The car didn't follow a single instruction provided by an engineer or programmer. Instead, it relied entirely on an algorithm that had taught itself to drive by watching a human do it. Now, once again, is this seen to be an issue? Let's look into that. Recall, issues are real and existing. They are not fictive. They can be sensed or observed. Both is absent in here. You see something that you really can't relate to. It's something that is new to you, but it's not a real issue. So it could turn easily into some. At this point, however, it's only scary and worrisome. And if it's problematic, then hypothetically problematic at this point in time only. Let's look into a further example. Everybody is talking about the Internet of Things, a buzzword supposed to magically solve all challenges inherent in digital transformation. With such projections, company leaders feel the urge to invest in IoT, but are often held back by a lack of accurate and credible calculations for the expected return on potential initiatives. According to our HBR Pulse survey, 80 to 90% of respondents can't accurately measure ROIs for their initiatives. Not to lose traction against their competitors, some companies even started initiatives for projects without a proper business case at hand. Unsurprisingly, failure rates of digital transformation initiatives lie in the range of 60 to 85%. The good news is that most of the elite groups that do measure returns are seeing relatively quick paybacks. Now, looking into this, can you tell if there are any issues in here? Anything for a researcher that would provide a good ground for research? I mean, it's an exciting, complex situation. So let's look into that in detail. Let's look into the argument, challenges inherent in digital transformation. Well, that's not an issue, but a challenge. And it's a quite generic expressed one. So there wouldn't be much research that you could carry out on that grounds. Then let's look into the statement that there's a lack of accurate and credible calculations for the expected return on potential initiatives. No, that's not an issue, but a clear problem. So why is this lack there? That would be a question. And how is this unique for or different for the IoT case? So there is a clear problem, but it is unclear whether or not this problem is unique or different to the IoT case, or if generally a lack of accurate and credible calculations for expected return on potential initiatives is a problematic thing to happen. Now, start initiatives or projects without a proper business case at hand. Now, that's clearly not an issue, but a question about informed decisions. If someone starts an initiative without a proper business case at hand, then this is certainly a good thing to do. And the last argument of that article, failure rates of digital transformation initiatives lie in the range of 60 to 85%. Now, that's not an issue, but a conclusion based on evidence, and that can be used to avoid failure. Now, are there really any issues in here? Well, as it turns out, from a research perspective, that would be a difficult article from which to derive a concrete and clear research problem and consequent research question. Let's look into a fourth and final example on what an issue might be. Now, is this an issue? Seeing the car got crashed. Yes, now we're talking about something real. That wasn't meant to be. So there's something concrete for us to look into and to understand why has this happened, which could be the initial research question. Why is this happening? But do we need to wait as a researcher to carry out research only once the car has crashed? No, surely not. We can do anticipate and we can engage in foresight. But this is not a synonym to gamble on random solutions. What if, could I have done, then would happen that? This is not the way to work. Instead, we should draw on the scientific method and to work over existing root causes well before the crash happened. We could look, for example, into have the sensors in that car functioned. If all of the sensors have functioned, we can rule out that being a reason for the accident to happen. If sensors have not functioned, we could use related cases where sensors are in use already for a long time and how sensors malfunctioning has impacted and occurred there. So therefore, we can work over patterns and trends or over systemic structures, which we take forward from one area into another. So often what students then say, but this has never happened before, so we need to speculate. Now, this is not the case, because as said, we can look into related fields. We just need to be aware about such related fields and aware about the transferability from one domain to another. If you look, for example, as into falling sensors as a potential reason for the crash in that car, and you look into manufacturing, you will have sensors there for many years already in use. So you can look at studies that were carried out in that area, so to convert and transfer the learnings into this. So never happened before is something that rarely occurs. Ever that you think that never happened before, the likelihood that the boundaries are just too close or too big is very high. Are there any questions up to this point? All right, then let's go into the third part on how to frame problems. One of the means to frame problems is the problem, what's the problem we presented to be approached. If forms of training are recommended to improve women's status and promotion opportunities, the implication is that their lack of training is a problem responsible for holding them back. So this is a clear example where the primary research question then is not how to improve the training, but what is causing such lack of training in the first instance. So we relate the problem to the solution, but from the solution way back, which means that we work first over the situation that is undesired, and of course, which we would know how it could be better to have trained women, to then look backwards in why aren't women trained. Now, this means that the problem is presented next to its partner, the solution. However, an issue in here is that in an area where problem solving is nearly hegemonic, such approach would come in very interruptional because many minds are again not trained to focus on the problem and therefore ultimately would look into the solution and which in this case, if we go back, would be how can we improve the training of women, which clearly is our outcome expectation, what we want to achieve with our research, but what we need to do to achieve that is we need to look back. What is causing such lack of training in the first instance? Once we understand that, we then can move forward and derive research questions that would allow us to more detailed find out what is happening here and how this ultimately could lead towards improving the training of women. Now, unfortunately, in most contemporary Western parts of the world, the eagerness rather focuses on producing students as problem solvers, and as the very word already says it, the word problem is immediately associated with the word solving, which looks at the solution. So we not even give students a chance to understand that looking at problem is a very dedicated part of undertaking research and not being biased by the solution or on how to solve it is critical. So to carry out research following the scientific method. Now then, how to problematize and articulate research problems. Perhaps one of the approaches, and a very old one actually, if you look at the picture at the right side, is the ABT method, the and, but, therefore. The ABT is the spine of the hero's journey, which Vogler describes as the handbook of life. The hero lives in a world of peace and contentment, but then a problem rises. Therefore, the hero sets out in a journey to solve the problem. Now, what has that to do with science? Well, we can translate that immediately to research. For example, this is true and observable, and this is true and observable, or this data exists, but the problem statement coming in, therefore, this is how we are addressing the problem. Now, this is still very abstract, and we will look into that a bit further. The end allows to hit the main points about the research and the relevant facts for the synthesis study, but introduces conflict. This is the heart of narrative storytelling. It allows to transition away from the world as we know it into the reasons why this research is necessary. And so therefore, afterwards, is a synthesis detailing how the research will address and potentially resolve the situation. And while the situation might not be resolved, incorporating a resolving statement can serve to build a connection between the research and the stakeholder involved and to keep continuity. And we will look further into how that can be translated. Now, in the case of a and T, an and therefore problem statement, that might look like that. With the world population projected to reach 10 billion by the year 2050, humankind is faced with a challenge to sustainably satisfy unprecedented figures of primary energy demand, an increasing fraction of which is to placate the collective thirst for information and communication technologies, which will consume this energy. The ambition of this research project is to overcome the efficiency bottlenecks of third-generation photovoltaic systems and unleash new functionalities with a vision towards faster and less power need. So this is an example from a real research project where the researcher has formulated very well the end, which shows in yellow highlighted the problem, and the therefore what needs to be done, because he in particular has looked into it and has understood that bottlenecks here lays in third-generation photovoltaic systems. However, this is a but that in the current research proposal has been omitted. It's invisible. The researcher only indirectly is introducing it by presenting the therefore. Now, in an ABT statement where the B, the but also would be shown, this example will show us. The sea-white coral may serve as essential habitat for many commercial valuable species in the mid-Atlantic, and there has been evidence of damage and overgrowth by fooling organisms of seabirds in fished areas. But little is known about the local reefs, nor the individual sea webs that comprise them, despite their potential importance to commercial fishery. Therefore, we are examining the age, colony, complexity, growth, and regrowth after damage of sea wipes from 4 sites in the Delmarva region in an effort to reconcile this knowledge gap. Now, this again is a real research project that has been carrying out, and that shows very well how the A, B, and T has been implemented, so to build up an argument, to problematize the situation, and to derive a research question directly from there. So this is a very logical process forward. Now, this can work out with a research problem as a start point, means you have a very well understanding about what the problem constitutes. Like, for example, here the organization is showing a high fluctuation rate as a leadership team is lacking people management skills. So the above example is clearly broke. It has a cause and effect relationship in place, and their short and precise initial observation and evidence are mentioned. So from that, is therefore could be very well derived on what would you be doing. Namely, in this case, looking into why the leadership team is lacking people management skills. Now, on the other hand, if you have the problem statement as a starting point, then you might have an example like this. The organization is showing a high fluctuation rate as the leadership team is lacking people management skill. Now, it's the same situation. And while the problem seems to be clear, and the reason why the leadership team is lacking the management skills is very much unknown. And this is what the research will be finding out. Now, the trickiness with the ABT approach, as with many approaches that could be applied, is that it's very obvious in hindsight, but blurry at the start of the research. But remember, problematization, problem framing, and research question framing is an iterative process. Therefore, as your research progresses, as more it will become clear how the A, B, and T's, of which there will be likely many in your research, would relate to each other and what these are concretely. Now, I hope those examples have allowed to illustrate a bit what the ABT process is about. If not, please use the forum function or afterwards discussion to look into this further. So how to derive research questions and ensure that these are actionable. Now, what is an actionable research question in the first place? Actionable in the most basic form means that the question should be framed in a way that allows you to act upon it. So questions are geared towards exploring who, what, where, how, and why might be actionable. And for the purpose of the research, the question explores the proper. Let's look into some value of actionable research questions, or the contrary to that. Much of an executive's workday is spent asking others for information. Few executives think of questioning as a skill. Questioning is a uniquely powerful tool for unlocking value in organization. It spurs learning and the exchange of ideas. It fuels innovation and performance improvement. So therefore, the value of an actionable research question very much depends on where you put value in. Do you want this dialogue? Do you want to explore? Or do you want rather to spend the time on asking information? Now, depending on the way you are going down, depending the situation might look like. And this here is a very concrete example from IBM on decision-making support through questioning. During the 60s, the Big Blue had the opportunity to buy or license Xerox's new reprographic photo processing copies. IBM hired a consulting firm to answer the following questions. If a more reliable, cheaper, and faster processing firm were available, how many more copies from the originals would people make in a given year? Now, however important that inquiry may have been, IBM asked the wrong question. What should have asked IBM instead? IBM ignored a new segment of the market that had turned out to be many times larger, namely copies of copies of copies. This was a huge overlooked opportunity. What if IBM had asked instead, how might the new Xerox process change when and how people make copies, and what might this grow to in total numbers of copies made in future years? So while that last questions would be future oriented, it would work over looking back into related fields as much as the Tesla model example that we presented earlier. So question framing can make a difference, and it is, again, your decision on where to focus. So then, is it the question or is it the answer? Asking the right question is like any other form of creation. You have to start somewhere, then form it into shape over time. What I meant by this What's that? Sometimes you have to start with something rough and unpolished to get in an initial response, to at least do something then over time with feedback, form it into what it needs to become to get you the results you're looking for. Formulating a magnificent question is just like building a product feature or a system in a business. It takes iteration, right? We had said earlier, it takes iteration to build up a research question and to derive it from the problem. So as the problem becomes more clear, so does the research question. And this is evolving over time. So iteration is key onto this, and the focus on the problem and also understanding that in hindsight, things are always much clearer as once you're in the midst of the research. This is a totally normal process. And looking into this, and we have a dedicated webinar on mirroring, it becomes quite obvious what is missing. So you can match out and illustrate very well all of your thesis structure, all of the data that you're working with, so to understand clearly what is missing and what relates how. So why is it hard to craft research questions then? Because of the relationship in between the problem statement, the research question, and the outcome expectation. The research question should be derived from the problem, the end in the apt. However, there's a tendency to ask questions with a bias towards the outcome expectations, which are the things that I really want as a researcher to look into. This is where my motivation is. And this bias is often facilitated at the beginning of the research, where students frequently have an outcome expectation. I know what I want to achieve with my research, but there's not a real understanding about what the actual problem is. So, and therefore the questions are often not derived from the research problem. If that does make sense to this point. And in the closing, we will look into guides and guidance and how they can misguide researchers even further, and unfortunately unintended often do. Many guides suggest things that you consider that you simply don't know. Recall at the beginning of the webinar, the related literature, the relevant literature, you do know that at that point in time. So how can you tell about significance or background of an issue if you still haven't understood what the issue is? That's clearly not possible. So therefore, basics first, and focus on defining the problem. This is not a time lost, but a time invested well. And then derive actionable research questions and understand this is an iterative process. And it's not one directional, it's both or multi-directional. As your research progresses, so does the knowledge, so does the literature understanding, so does the problem statement. So this is a front and back juggle. And many guides talk about importance for working out the goals, desired state, value, vision, the so-called 5 what. So everything that's shiny, that is pointing you rather into the direction of looking into a solution and gears your attention away from looking into the problem and try to problematize. So this is perhaps also important to understand whenever there are shiny words that are polished and that look at something great, be aware that that might misdirect you or that you're just misinterpreting what the other wants to tell to you. Because those ones that write the guides know how science works and that all positives will only be the result of having examined the problem first. Yeah, if you keep that in mind and read the guides in accordance, that can avoid misguidance. And obviously, to learn the basics of how to problematize and how to draft a clear problem statement will help you to develop a problem mindset and put away your solution and envisioning classes. Now, let's look into what that in concrete could mean, how tips could misguide you. Let's look into this tip that goes, researchers should begin by identifying a broader subject of interest that lends itself to investigation. Now, what you read here is broader subjects, but it does not mean actually to start broad. One still is expected to start from a very specific issue. What is broken here? What is meant with this tip is that subsequently the specific issue must be placed in the broader subject of interest. What's going on in here? And this interest in this regard should direct you to ask, what is the actual problem? And that will be examined. So, a false friend that often misguides students. Likewise, let's look into this other tip and what it's not meant to be. Begin to narrow the topic by asking open-ended how and why questions. Yeah, here I can see where you're going. For example, a researcher may want to consider the factors that contribute to childhood obesity or the success rate of intervention programs. Now, understand the guiding is not suggesting that you focus on the success rate of intervention programs. What the guidance suggests instead is that you focus on the factors that are contributing to. Thus, your research investigates factors that are contributing to whatever, but not the success rate of intervention programs. Another thing that can misguide you here is begin to narrow the topic by asking open-ended how and why questions. And the next thing that happened before I even close my guidance to the student is that the student is off to someone and talks to him about something, not knowing why and what, right? Again, why is this happening? Because it's exciting. I can talk to someone. That's cool. Let's talk and find out how and why. I can talk in the hours. No, please do not refrain from doing so. The guidance is not suggesting you for doing so. So if you want to learn more about that, as said, this is a very iterative process, and it is something that you will learn over the entire course of your doctoral research journey and likely even beyond. We have a course available for free self-study with peer support, fully tutored or flexible on-demand feedback that exactly is dedicated to issue identification, problematizing, and research question framing. And if you're at the very beginning of your research, we are about to launch a course dedicated on how to develop your thesis proposal, which will be available in roughly 2 weeks from now. You're also welcome to check back. With this, we go into the group activity, which is optional, and it's meant to be a reflection, just looking at 2 statements and how they could be interpreted. So it's a collaborative activity. I will go off the recording now, and if you have any questions before we go into the activity, please come in.